What's up, folks? So way back in April of 2025, I made a very bold claim. I made a very bold claim that the Nintendo Switch 2 would struggle to meet the forecasts that Nintendo expects at the current pricing strategy that it holds. I doubled down on this argument. I tripled down on this argument. And as a matter of fact, I kind of really angered some people with this argument. But ultimately, the truth was in front of everyone. The Nintendo Switch 2 has managed to reach its worldwide forecast, but it was only able to do so with worldwide discounts during its holiday season. These discounts naturally occurred where you normally see these types of discounts start off immediately. In all of those other categories that you usually see on the financial reports, your Latin Americas, your smaller markets around Europe, Middle East, Russia, etc. Those discounts started day one, and those are very normal. They happen for almost every console. But what was more interesting was that starting in October, we saw the first discounts in France. Eventually, this carried on over to Spain, the United Kingdom, Germany. And every time one of these price drops or discounts popped up in any of these countries, people suggested that these discounts were not indicative of poor sales for the Nintendo Switch 2. Now, I've made ample videos proving otherwise, but just to quickly summarize, by searching on Google, using the translate function, searching for Nintendo Switch discounts or Nintendo Switch price drops in 2017 and 2018, all over various different regions, using the French translation, the German translation, the Spanish translation, you will not be able to find a link that shows price drops and discounts in the same way that we saw for the Nintendo Switch 2 starting from October with the launch of Pokemon. And of course you won't. Everybody knows you won't. Every time one of these discounts were announced, there was always some type of a headline that would pop up with the article that would say this is a very unexpected price drop. But there was a lot of gaslighting going on in the online communities that the Nintendo Switch 2 was actually selling very well in these regions and in these countries with the price drops, and that the only reason those discounts were happening is because the stores were trying to be loss leaders. They were trying to be competitive. But then, of course, as we get closer to the holiday season, we find out that the Nintendo Switch 2, which started off launching almost double the amount of units that the Nintendo Switch 1 managed to pull off, had a slower holiday season in pretty much every single country in the world. These are obviously sold through numbers that we get from the actual retailers and the markets and the analysts that research this information. What you are currently seeing from Nintendo is their shipped number. I don't know what that video is right now because I'm working on this video prior to that even being uploaded, but I will certainly making another follow-up video where I analyze the numbers in the financial reports that was uploaded by Nintendo tonight, in the same way that I always have, because I never shy away from this stuff. I cannot promise when the video will come out. The last one took me 3 days to work on, it was over an hour long. But this video should keep you busy in the meantime. In any case, we know without a doubt that the Nintendo Switch 2 had a very poor holiday season in every single country in the world. In the States specifically, it had a worse November and December than almost every single year that the Switch 1 had experienced. And in every single European nation that we got data for, the data indicated that the Switch 2 started off on launch with almost double the amount of consoles sold as the Switch 1 did, and by the time it got to the end of its holiday season, it was either just below what the Switch 1 managed or just above what the Switch 1 managed in its first year. Now, obviously, when you align the launches, the Switch 1 did it in 7 months and the Switch 2 did it in 10 months. But again, if you follow the data, you see that the Switch 2 launched in June. By the time the Switch 1 got to June, it was roughly at the same number of units sold everywhere as the Switch 2 was in the end of its June. Because as we all know, the Nintendo Switch 1 was severely supply constrained, whereas the Switch 2 wasn't. But to simplify the discussion, if you align June 30th, 2025 with June 30th, 2017, the Switch 2 is actually ahead of the Switch 1. The Switch 2 in 1 month did what the Switch 1 did up to June, and it released in March. So that means through July, August, September, October, November, and December, the Switch 2 sold comparably to the Switch 1. In some markets, like in the US, it actually closed off the year much lower than the Switch 1 was. In Europe, it's a bit of a mixed bag. In France, which is the largest market, it sold fewer units in France than the Switch 1 managed in its first year. And in markets like in the United Kingdom and Spain and Germany, where the Switch 1 famously had a very slow start, the Switch 2 just barely managed to scrape by the first year of the Switch 1 in those countries. And of course, in Japan, the Nintendo Switch 2 outperformed the Switch 1 comfortably in its first year, even with the supply constraints that Nintendo caused for the Japanese population. Now the difference is, in Japan, Nintendo actively priced the console with the consideration of the economy, of the local economy that is, so they priced it based off of what they think Nintendo fans would be willing to pay in Japan. Through everywhere else in the world, they priced it significantly more than anybody could have possibly imagined the console coming out. So it makes complete sense why the sales numbers in Japan were very comfortable, whereas in the rest of the world, outside of that very first month where it broke all the records because of Nintendo stockpiling, and you knew you were going to get so many day one enthusiasts that were chasing all of the hype of the console being available, outside of that window, almost immediately after it, on a worldwide scale outside of Japan, the console began to sit on shelves. And now we know, when we look at the numbers, despite the massive lead and the massive head start that the console had ahead of the Switch 1, the weekly sales from those months in between July and November were so slow that just about on a worldwide scale, price drops were necessary to somewhat salvage the Switch 2's first year. But the problem is all of these price drops came directly from the retailers, they weren't from Nintendo. So the retailers had to eat it. And I will be very interested to see how that looks for the Nintendo Switch 2 going forward, because retailers usually don't like to take losses on items when the manufacturer is overcharging for it. So this will naturally be reflected in the next quarterly reports, not in the one that was just uploaded right now. Many of these retailers on a worldwide scale definitely overordered Nintendo Switch 2s in preparation for the holiday season, because they figured that's when everybody's finally going to come out to buy the console, especially with all of the discounts that they were doing, whether Nintendo liked it or not. But even then, those holiday sales numbers were nothing in comparison to what the Nintendo Switch 1 could ever do in any of its holiday seasons. Now, with the Nintendo Switch 2 closing off 2025 in most markets just about level with the Nintendo Switch 1, you can't exactly say it's a failure. After all, the Nintendo Switch 1 went on to sell 150 million units. The big difference, however, is that the Switch 1 started off very slow because it was coming off of the Wii U, and the Switch 1 gained momentum with every month after its launch. Once again, this was a discussion that I brought up very early on and people didn't quite grasp onto until the end of 2025. I told them that the Switch 2 starting off was going to be much higher than the Switch 1, and eventually they're going to converge in sales numbers, because the Switch 1 will have gained momentum while the Switch 2 loses momentum. We are currently at the convergence, and again I'm talking about the actual units that are sold, not the ones that are shipped, because the ship numbers are going to be much higher for the Switch 2 for now. Give it another quarter and we'll see where it's at. Following this convergence, I expect the Switch 2 to drop below the Switch 1. I don't know exactly when it's going to reflect with launches aligned, but at some point we'll all be looking back at this and realize that yeah, it makes complete sense that the Switch 1 surpassed the Switch 2 in X amount of time, in the same way that right now people are trying to gaslight everybody into saying that the Switch 2 performed better than anybody expected in 2025, when the clear thoughts for most people was that the Nintendo Switch 2 would continue that launch momentum and close off the year significantly higher than anything that the Switch 1 had managed in 2017. This was the common consensus online as soon as the Switch 2 launched. Actually, prior to the Switch 2 even launching, this was the belief. It would close off 2025 with significantly more end users actually buying the console and playing the games than the Nintendo Switch 1 did. But all of the sales data is showing that it's a lot closer than you think. And the Switch 1 went on to have a very good 2018. We'll see what the Switch 2 does in 2026. All I know is that right now, there aren't really many games that are going to be convincing people to pick up the console. But at the end of the day, even if the Switch 2 carries on and continues to sell more units and ends up being a success, we all made our voices heard and we all voted with our wallets. The Nintendo fandom is massive. The amount of sales the Switch 2 has reached to the user base is a fraction of the people that would have bought the console when it launched. But we all made it very clear with our backlash and our boycott against the Nintendo Switch 2 that we would not buy this console without significant reductions in price. And that came out to be exactly correct, even though so many people denied that it was even possible for a brand new console to get any kinds of discounts in its first year. The way the conversation went, in the beginning they said you would not be able to find this console anywhere on shelves, at least until the holiday season. We very quickly saw this wasn't the case. The console was sitting on shelves by the end of July, pretty much worldwide, in most places some even by June. And then they suggested that the console would never get a discount and it's never going to be cheaper than it is right now. This was the talk from April, May, June, July, August, and September. There was never a single thought in anybody's mind that it would actually be possible that the Switch 2 would ever get a discount because it would sell so well, and consoles don't get a discount, especially Nintendo consoles. It's not a thing. But lo and behold, it hits October and the Switch 2 gets discounts. Even now, February of 2026, all over Europe, the Switch 2 is still cheaper than it was when it launched. And in the United States, right now, you can go to any Micro Center, create an account, a free account, just email and password, and you can buy a Nintendo Switch non-bundle for $400. It is still cheaper today than it was when it launched. And all of these discounts and price cuts are proof that when we spoke out and we said that Nintendo was charging too much for the Nintendo Switch 2, we were absolutely right about this. And if right now the people that are buying the console are the most enthusiastic, and so many of them required the price drops in order to get the numbers at the holiday season to equal what the Switch 1 did, I am so excited to see in 2026 what Nintendo has to do to make people buy this console. And if it's not Nintendo, it's going to be the retailers. And eventually, the retailers are going to run out of that stock. The question is if they feel like they need to get rid of it because it's not moving, or if Nintendo works with the retailers and allows some kind of a price discount, maybe even officially announcing a worldwide price drop so that the console can continue the pace with the Nintendo Switch 1. But whatever the case is, we've shown that in the first year, Nintendo charged too much for the Nintendo Switch 2. And no matter how much people want to gaslight you into thinking that boycotts are failures and people don't vote with their wallets and Nintendo fans are all mindless, they're just gonna buy things anyway, those of us that did not buy the Nintendo Switch 2, we are Nintendo fans. And those of us that bought it at a discount after a price drop on a worldwide level are also Nintendo fans. And we showed that Nintendo cannot get away with greed and cannot get away with price gouging. We've been saying it since April. The Nintendo Switch 2 is overpriced. And so far, the retailers all around the world have agreed with us. Something that hasn't been done with any console launch in my recent memory, whether it was through COVID or back in the Switch 1 days. I've never seen a discount like this for any console on its launch, especially on a worldwide level. So keep that in mind, as I'm sure currently Nintendo fans will be gloating about the quarterly reports that just released for the Switch 2. And keep an eye on my channel because I will be making a video about those reports myself very soon. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.